Congratulations, you've just found the #1 over 50 health and wellness podcast on the planet. Hello and welcome to the Over 50 Health and Wellness Show. I'm your host, Kevin English. I'm a healthy aging expert and the founder of the Silver Edge, and I am on a mission to help men and women just like you build lean, strong, healthy, capable bodies they love for the rest of their lives. All right, folks, today we are diving into something that every one of us deals with, whether we realize it or not, and that's our blood sugar. Now, before you guys check out and think, hey, Kev, I don't have diabetes. Why do I care about blood sugar? Hang tight, because your blood sugar is directly tied to your energy, your cravings, your ability to burn fat, and even how sexy and confident you feel in your own skin. Joining me today is Kara Collier. She's founder and VP of Health over at Nutrisense and one of the brightest minds in metabolic health today. She's a registered dietitian, she's a Forbes 30 Under 30 honoree, and a total rock star when it comes to showing people how to use simple, practical strategies and even some cutting-edge tech like continuous glucose monitors to take control of their health and to feel amazing. So whether you want to lose some stubborn belly fat, maybe beat those 3 p.m. crashes, or just feel younger and stronger in the second half of your life, you're going to love today's conversation. Kara's going to show us how to play the glucose game, and more importantly, she's going to show us how to win it. So whip up your protein smoothies and let's meet Kara.
I'm a registered dietitian. I got into that field. I wanted to be a dietitian since I was very young because I wanted to help people, and I really believed in the power of lifestyle and nutrition. So when I first graduated, an eager, young 23-year-old, 24-year-old, entered traditional healthcare, so hospital systems, working primarily in ICUs in critical care nutrition, and very quickly realized that I wasn't able to help people in the way that I was hoping to. So most of the people coming into the ICU were not gunshot wounds or traumatic events, but typically it was uncontrolled diabetes where we were having to put you on dialysis or amputate a leg, or uncontrolled heart failure. All of these lifestyle related conditions that take 30, 40, 50 years to do their damage. And now we have all this pain and suffering and consequences because of that. So I tried my best to do what I could within the existing system, but it was very frustrating. It was also very sad because there was a lot of unnecessary suffering that I felt like I was experiencing. So fast forward a few years, I went to different nutrition software startup where I really fell in love with kind of going a health tech direction and empowering the actual consumer rather than kind of within the sick care system. But through all of that, I kept coming back to some of those problems I was seeing in the hospital and trying to understand, like, what are some root cause denominators? What are some themes here? And two things really emerged. One being that metabolic health is really an undercurrent of a lot of these chronic conditions that end up being the majority of the complications you see in healthcare. And then another being that, you need to interact with someone much sooner before those problems occur to really move the needle. And really the last thing being that you can intervene at the right moment. You can have all the right knowledge in the world, but if you aren't able to turn that into behavior change, like real lasting habits that are sustainable, then you also don't have the outcomes we're looking for. So when I'm playing with all of those ideas, I became obsessed with the continuous glucose monitors, or CGMs, because they kind of addressed one of those root cause systems, glucose and metabolic health. If we empowered people to wear them sooner, we could catch things earlier. And then just the nature of a 24/7 data stream is a powerful behavior change tool. So all those things together kind of led me to start Nutrisense about 6.5 years ago, kind of with this, at the time, was a wild idea to use CGMs outside of a really medical setting. Now it's a much more common and normal, and more people are talking about it, thankfully. But at the time, a lot of people thought we were pretty crazy.
Yeah, I bet. Okay, so that's a fascinating story. I love that you started in traditional healthcare, or you refer to it as sick care at one point, became quickly disillusioned. And we've heard other doctors on the show say the exact same thing, right? It's, hey, I was an emergency room trauma surgeon. And I wasn't working on gunshots and broken legs and car crash victims so much as I was the overweight 15, 60, 70-year-old who had a heart attack or massive heart failure, et cetera. And as somebody who felt this calling to help people, I think that's why most people get into healthcare, realizing they're not really, I mean, they are helping, right? You're doing symptom care really,
Yeah.
but just trying to get out in front of that, right? So I love that you do that. Now, you talked about getting to the root cause of some of this. And you said, hey, one of the things I got fascinated with early on is these CGMs, these continuous glucose monitors. So let's back up a little bit and let's talk about just what is a CGM for anybody who's not familiar with that. And then a little bit of the history of that, because that's fairly recent technology, right?
Yeah, it is. And it's evolved quite a bit in a short amount of time. So that CGM, which I'll use instead of saying the full continuous glucose monitor, is exactly what it sounds like. So it's a small, they've gotten smaller actually, but quarter to dime size piece of hardware. So a wearable device, but it was historically a medical device. But how it works now is you kind of put them on the back of your arm, and some manufacturers of different devices let you put them on your stomach as well. And I always call it an easy button if everyone remembers those commercials back in the day, but it's kind of a device you put on at home. You just push the button and then it's in the back of your arm. So there's this very, very small microfilament that gets placed just below the surface of the skin. So not even to the depth of your blood vessels. It's just barely puncturing and measuring the glucose in your interstitial fluid, which is the fluid between cells. And so it's very painless. It's very simple. There's no needle that stays in your arm. It's just for insertion. People are always shocked by how much it does not hurt to put it on. And then it stays on for 2 weeks at a time. So you leave it on, you sleep with it, you shower with it, you work out with it on, and it's tracking your glucose in 5-minute increments, kind of 24/7. So then you use, of course, an app to be able to read that data and kind of see what's happening. So it's giving you that movie picture view of your glucose when normally, we're only getting those little snapshots in the ways that we would previously track glucose. So, either a finger prick or a fasting glucose level or a hemoglobin A1C.
Gotcha. Okay. So you mentioned that, it's been 7.5 years since you started Nutrisense?
Yeah, about 6.5.
6.5 years. So at that time, who was wearing CGMs? Was it just diabetes patients? Was this starting to get out into, say, athletes or people with obesity and maybe pre-diabetes? What were they using it for when you started back then?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when we started, it was pretty much exclusively insulin-dependent diabetics. So meaning the type 1 diabetes, which is the autoimmune condition, you're usually born with it or get it in adolescence, or kind of insulin-dependent type 2 diabetes. So only about a third of type 2 diabetics at that time had ever worn a CGM, which is pretty crazy. So it wasn't even that widespread within the diabetic community. And it was a medical device. You did need a medical prescription. So if you, as a pre-diabetic, went to your physician and said, I really think a CGM would be interesting, I'm hearing about this, you would be relying on them to agree with you and to write the script for you, which most of the time was not the case. And that was part of the gap that we saw, is that I saw firsthand that this information helped a broader audience of people. It's very, very important for diabetics, but can also be really helpful for a broader audience. But physicians typically weren't seeing that or weren't doing it. And so we wrote prescriptions for people, shipped them their devices. But now, fast forward, 5 or so years later, and last summer, there are consumer devices that are now available. So over the counter. They became available over the counter in Europe like a decade or two ago. So we're, a little slower. Yeah. And in Canada too, actually. So we're a little slower to adopt that. And now we use those devices as well. So it's brought the pricing down significantly and increased the accessibility, which is great. And then on our side, you can either bring your own device or we can ship it to you. And then we overlay our own, software and then nutrition dietitian services actually as well.
All right. So I love it. So let's, just to be clear then, today I don't need a prescription for one of these devices. Is that right? You guys just ship them out?
They're consumer versions, but there are still medical
grade versions,
that require a prescription.
All right. I want to get into all the things, glucose and monitoring and what affects it, all that stuff. But let's back up a little bit. Maybe let's do a glucose 101. Can you give us a little bit of primer? Why this interest in glucose and how are we tying this to metabolic health?
Yeah, very good question. I think these are terms that are starting to get thrown around a little more often now, but
I think you're right.
I
Yeah.
still feel though most people don't fully understand it. So it's always good
Mm-hmm.
to take a step back and do a little defining. But starting with metabolic health, it's really all of the processes and systems that are required to produce energy. So turn food into energy and then utilize that energy. So that means it's affecting all aspects of our body because everything we do requires energy. So that's kind of the high level view of metabolic health. And of course, when we understand it like that, we can understand that the implications are much broader than just diabetes or obesity. And then if you think about metabolic health as this kind of like complex system of processing energy, like telling the energy where to go, storing it, metabolizing it, then you can think of glucose as kind of the fuel system, one of the primary fuel system within that energy system as a whole. So glucose and fat. So when we're able to monitor glucose in those 24/7 levels, not only can we see if that system is starting to break down, so that kind of gets us into insulin resistance is when we're not processing energy as well. We might eat something, kind of a normal, healthy meal, and our glucose levels go really high, which means the system's not really working that well. When we can get that insight, then we can understand where we might need to fine tune some things. And so by monitoring your glucose, you're understanding what's happening within that energy balancing system. So I like to think about glucose as more akin to a vital sign, so something like heart rate or blood pressure, where the normal day-to-day fluctuations kind of tell you how that food impacted you, but it's also giving you a broader view of your health and kind of homeostasis rather than just an indicator of diabetes, which is how I think most people think of glucose, where really it's much broader than that.
So a normal person can put one of these on and then they can eat, and in real time they can see what their blood sugar's doing. Okay. And I think I'm just fascinated by this whole medical technology field and personalized medicine, right? So this is kind of taking the wearables to the next level. So what might I expect? So I think that probably the listener out there is thinking, okay, so sugar is going to spike it, right? If I have, a soda, that's going to spike it. How much variation is there? Are there broad rules that we can say, okay, if you eat low glycemic index foods, you probably won't see much of a spike. And if you eat high glycemic index foods, there's going to be a big spike. Is there some rules we can draw from that? Or is it really, how much, I guess, individual variance is there from person to person?
Yeah, a little bit of both. So we certainly see some things where it's just kind of, I can almost expect that from everybody. If you do this thing, it's most likely going to be a big spike, or, eat this food. But the amount of bioindividuality between people is much greater than I expected when I first started doing this. So when we first started, there was pretty much no data available about what continuous glucose monitoring data looks like from non-diabetics specifically, even pre-diabetics, and healthy people or those thinking about prevention or just weight loss. And what I found firsthand looking at this was, each person is very, very unique. So glycemic index that you mentioned is kind of a population level predictor of how much your glucose will rise after eating something. But that's kind of a population average. And then people individually fall all over, that scale. So myself as an example, I've eaten pretty much every fruit you could ever think of while wearing a CGM to kind of see what happens. And I consistently have low glucose responses, almost the lowest out of all fruit, to bananas, which is a very high glycemic index food traditionally. And I will say most times, like 9 times out of 10, people do have higher responses to bananas, but I, for whatever reason, don't. So there's lots of little things like that people just learn from themselves by trying it out. And then there's also differences depending on the setting. So we could talk about some of the kind of common rules that we see with people, but one big thing is that you might eat something at a certain time of day versus a different time of day and see a different response. Or if you eat it after a workout versus on a day that you didn't work out, you're going to see a big difference. Or even different seasons of your life. So it might be when you're under really high periods of stress versus not under stress. So One thing that I always encourage people to think about when they're using these for the first time and looking at the data and learning is kind of understanding that just because you have a glucose spike one time does not mean we can never eat that food again. It might mean to try a few experiments to figure out kind of what strategy works for that food and figure out kind of the different backup plans that you can have, so to speak. So instead of ending up with a more restrictive diet at the end of wearing CGMs, people usually just end up with more tools. Like, I can eat this as long as I do my regular workout, those kind of things.
Got it. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about what healthy blood sugar is, or what healthy glucose is. I think most people know that you go to your doctor, you're going to have your A1C checked. That's just a spot in time, right? It's check. But what am I looking for? Because you're talking about these peaks and of course low blood sugar, high blood sugar. What do I want? What's optimal when I'm looking at this data?
Yeah, good question. I mean, you can think about it kind of in two categories. So, what's happening to your glucose when you're in a fasted state versus what's happening when you're eating a meal. And then there's also separating maybe what traditional guidelines are versus like optimal glucose. So
Right.
when we're in a fasted state, our glucose does fluctuate when we're fasted. So people are always surprised to see like, oh, it went up and down 10 points, but I didn't really do anything. And that's normal. It's just your body kind of maintaining that homeostasis. But on average, we want our fasted glucose levels to be between 70 and 90, just on average. So while you're sleeping, kind of in the morning, whenever you've been without food for at least 8 hours. The other thing we want to look at a holistic picture is what your average glucose levels are, which is what a hemoglobin A1C is representing, but your average glucose levels from a CGM data are actually a more accurate representation because the A1C is just like not a perfect measure, but we want to keep our average glucose levels at 105 or lower. So that's kind of that optimal range.
Okay.
And then there's during eating. So when we have a meal, we're going to look at a few different things. We're going to look at how high does the glucose levels go. So that's kind of your peak or your spike. So that's that absolute value. For a non-diabetic, trying to aim for below 140, all of this is milligrams per deciliter, is sort of that sweet spot. So if you go to 150, that does not mean you're diabetic. That probably just meant that wasn't the best meal for you. You know, if you go in that 200s range, that's usually a little bit more indicative of potentially some insulin resistance and some more work to do. And then that second piece with the meals that we're going to look for is how quickly do you return back to kind of baseline pre-meal values. So we want to see within 2 to 3 hours of eating that you've returned close to what your glucose level was before you were eating, or kind of that under 100 range.
Got it. And when we're talking about these peaks, I've seen, and this comes from just Instagram and Facebook and things like that, but I've seen where people are kind of like, they're gaming the system. They have this CGM. They go, oh, well, if I have a handful of nuts before I have this other thing, then that causes the peak to be smaller. Is that the kind of behavior change that you're talking about, that I can sort of do this self-experimentation now? Oh, okay, I got a really high spike when I did that. Oh, but when I added this food to it, or I had this food right before it, I noticed a different change.
Yeah, absolutely. There are a few small hacks that you can do if you see a pretty big glucose spike. There are some hacks that I would consider good ideas, sustainable, and then there are other things that are maybe like you're decreasing the peak but adding something somewhere else. So good habits to consider are always starting your meal with some protein and fiber. So it's this concept of no naked carbohydrates. So think about when you go to a Mexican restaurant, the first thing they give you is
Sure.
tortilla chips and salsa. Almost
Yep.
everybody, 10 out of 10 times, are going to have a really big spike to those tortilla chips if it's on an empty stomach. So if you can wait till your meal comes, have a few bites of your protein first before having a few of those chips, it's actually going to make a really big difference. So kind of starting your meal with protein and some fiber, that helps a lot. Then if you're having that big spike, it can be just playing with portion sizes. So maybe it doesn't mean that we can never have tortilla chips again, but maybe we need to reduce the amount we're eating in total. So little things like that. Also movement, both before and after meals, can make a really big difference. So let's say you had a pretty big meal, or any meal really, trying to get a 10-15 minutes of movement after a meal, if possible, can really, really help just kind of utilize some of that glucose in circulation. So that might be walking around, or maybe just doing some chores, kind of cleaning off the kitchen or whatever it might be. And one other thing around meals that is really helpful for people is making sure that you are in a relaxed state when you're eating. So
I love it. Yeah.
we often see that people, they could eat the same exact meal on a Saturday versus a Wednesday afternoon while they're working, and they're multitasking, they're responding to emails, they're on the phone, and they're just kind of eating their food really fast, and they have a much higher glucose response when they're in that stress state. So practicing some mindful eating techniques and kind of when you're having a meal, remove other distractions, kind of enter that parasympathetic state, take a few deep breaths and kind of enjoy your meal. It's a better experience overall, but it also kind of helps get you in that calmer nervous system state and helps you digest better. So that can make a really big difference.
All right, great. Some very practical tips there. Absolutely love it. I want to talk about, well, before I go there, why are spikes bad? You're saying, hey, if you get this spike over, under 150, you're okay. 200, that's kind of a red flag. What's wrong with that? What's happening when I eat something and my blood sugar just spikes up like that?
Yeah, good question. So we can think about what's happening in a very zoomed in level and then kind of on a macro level. When we're thinking about a glucose spike at the cellular level, one of the biggest consequences is that it damages that really, really thin layer of cells in your blood vessels. So it's kind of damage to that microvasculature. So one thing many people don't realize is that often the largest consequence and medical complication of those with diabetes are heart disease and kind of conditions around that because of that damage to the microvasculature when your glucose is high. And it's also putting stress on your mitochondria. I'm sure your audience is probably familiar. This is the site at the cell where it's processing kind of the incoming energy. And I equate it to, when we flood it with energy, it's almost like putting the gas pedal all the way down. So you're flooring it, which the system knows how to do that. It's going to work. But if we're doing that every day, every time we're flooring the gas pedal, it causes some wear and tear on the system. So it causes more reactive oxygen species and inflammation and some damage. And if that happens once in a while, you have a glucose spike here or there, once a week, your body has processes to repair that. It's not a big deal. But if we're having it at every meal, then we might be accumulating damage faster than we can repair it. So it's really about making sure these spikes are not part of your everyday routine and everyday response so that we're not causing a lot of damage and stress to the system. Because if we accumulate that and you take that kind of that macro view, that's when we can start to see that cycle of insulin resistance and a little bit of metabolic dysfunction.
Okay, gotcha. I want to talk about the relationship between glucose and obesity. And I think this is a good segue into that, right? Because I think as we're looking at, hey, I'm eating these foods that are causing my blood sugar to spike. We're building up, and this is habitual. I'm seeing this in real time. I've got this excess glucose causing insulin resistance. How is that tied to obesity? What's happening there and metabolically or is it tied to obesity? I'm making the assumption that it certainly is.
Yeah, it certainly is. And there's several different factors at play there. So usually with any sort of condition or situation, it's multifactorial. So anytime anytime someone says this is the one thing that causes this thing, it's probably too simplistic. But part of that is what we just talked about, kind of that inflammation that can compound if you're having lots of elevated glucose levels. So inflammation can be a real driver of then obesity and some other complications. Another is that when we start to enter that cycle of insulin resistance, essentially what that means is that the hormone insulin is not working as well as it should be. And what insulin is supposed to be doing when it's working perfectly is that it's putting energy where it needs to go, right? So when we eat food and energy is coming in, insulin is released and it should quickly signal to the body that we need that energy there or store it there or kind of tap into it there. So when our metabolic system isn't working very well, it's kind of inefficient, that means we are inefficiently using energy. So if we can't tap into energy very efficiently or store it very well, then that often causes some of that weight gain and obesity problems. And tied with that is also it can affect our hunger and satiety signals. And that only compounds the effect of making it difficult to lose weight. So if we're not tapping into energy well, even though we have energy in circulation, you might feel hungry, even though there should be enough energy because that system is just inefficient. And of course, that makes it more difficult because you're going to want to eat more, even though we do have enough energy. So kind of a lot of different factors compounding there that can tie it all together.
Yeah. Okay. So I could see how if we have an inefficient system, we're not converting energy very well, and this is having this downstream effect and is causing us to make different food selections or have different, like you said, our satiety and our appetite is kind of off. Now, is it true that glucose is pretty easy for the body to store as fat? Is it fair to say that? So, is it the case then if I'm constantly have more glucose than my muscles can, because that's basically what glucose is, energy for my muscles, for my brain, for all of my processes
everything,
happening, everything, right? Is it safe to say that excess glucose is then just is the body saying, hey, great, we have this excess, what do we do with it? We'll just store it as fat?
Yeah, absolutely. And because of that concept of glucotoxicity, where too much glucose in the blood vessels is literally toxic, the body's just like, we have to shuttle this somewhere and get it out of the circulatory system, the blood vessels. So glucose can basically be used immediately for energy, or it can be stored as glycogen, which is kind of the short-term storage form of glucose. But glycogen can only be stored in our liver and our skeletal muscles. So our liver, hopefully, only gets so big. We don't want to expand our liver. So that's like a very finite storage system. And then skeletal muscle, varies quite widely from person to person how much storage we have there, which is another reason that building your muscle mass helps create more space for that glucose to go. That the body prefers to make it glycogen before fat, but if there's no room there, it's going to go straight to fat. So that's something where strength training is a really important tool. And when you also exercise and do any sort of movement, you're clearing out some of that glycogen to make more space for future glycogen. But if that's all full, then fat is going to be the kind of infinite form of long-term storage. So if we're not moving our bodies often or building up our muscle mass or kind of maintaining appropriate amount of glucose coming in, it's going to really just kind of go to that fat storage.
Yeah, that's not what we want.
Nope.
Especially those of us, in our 50s, 60s, 70s, right? That's just another case why every single one of us should be strength training regularly. We preach that all the time here.
Yeah.
And that's just another reason why we should do that. Before we move on, we've talked about blood sugar spikes. What about low blood sugar? What's that? Is that bad? Is that preferable? If a spike is bad, is a dip good?
Yeah, good question. So hypoglycemia is actually relatively uncommon in non-diabetics. So if you are not a diabetic, then the definition of low glucose is actually below 55 with symptoms. So symptoms of hypoglycemia means kind of like shaking, usually like sweaty, nervous, anxiety can feel like hypoglycemia. And so we do see this sometimes in non-diabetics, and it can happen in two different situations. One is what's called reactive hypoglycemia, which is much more common, and that's usually during a mealtime. So let's say you chugged a Gatorade because you were, on a walk outside and it was hot. So you chug the Gatorade, your glucose goes up really high, and your body almost overcorrects and sends too much insulin out. And so then we crash afterwards and we have that dip that is even lower than when your glucose was to start. And so that's that reactive hypoglycemia. And that can be relatively common if we're drinking or eating those really high sugary foods. And people can then feel shaky or kind of anxious, or you get the little bit of like the sugar jitters afterwards. And sometimes that can trigger the brain to then want to eat again, because hypoglycemia to the brain is a survival signal. Like, we are low on glucose, you need to eat something.
Yeah.
So we don't want to be on that roller coaster is a really, big thing to think about. And then there's fasting hypoglycemia, which is less common. And that might mean in the middle of the night, you're waking up because you are getting hypoglycemic. And typically that's caused by something else. So potentially a medication or alcohol can sometimes do this, or some sort of like thyroid condition or something like that.
Gotcha. Gotcha. So I'm kind of curious. I got to ask, what about a person on a ketogenic diet? Do they have, I mean, is theirs just like a straight and smooth and steady straight across all the time? What's going on with somebody who's not eating a whole bunch of carbs or very low carb?
Yeah, so if somebody is very low carb, then we really wouldn't expect glucose to go much above 120. So we do kind of communicate that to our customers of like, if you're not eating carbohydrates, 120 is probably the threshold we would expect. And it should feel relatively flat. Like there shouldn't be a ton of up and down if you're not having carbohydrates. But another kind of myth or not well-known fact about glucose is it's not just your food that can cause glucose spikes. So the other big area is stress. So we kind of alluded to that a little bit. So I've certainly seen my handful of people who are following a ketogenic diet who have a big glucose spike to 140 just purely from stress. So that's something to pay attention to whether you're following ketogenic diet or not. And then the other thing that's important if you're not having carbohydrates is what is that fasting glucose doing? Like you mentioned, the traditional kind of like prick your finger or get the blood draw is only showing that snapshot in time. And our fasting glucose levels do fluctuate. So we'll want to pay extra attention to kind of, are those fasting values where we expect them to be and kind of are they in a good range?
Okay, got it, got it. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what affects glucose, because obviously the obvious one is food, right? So let's start with that. Is it fair to say that if I were to prioritize real whole foods and cut out as much ultra processed food as is practical, is that just a really good first step?
Yeah, absolutely. I always start with like master the basics first.
Sure.
Everyone's always like, what supplement should I take?
Yeah, we'll get there, but let's start here, right?
Hack, but you got to master the basics. So really it gets you a long way to do exactly what you just said. So focus on whole foods, minimally processed foods, get plenty of protein. I know that you're an advocate for this as well, but that's really going to go a long way. Avoid liquid carbohydrates. So that's a big one. So that could be like the Gatorade I mentioned, but also coffees, oat milks, sweetened almond milks, like kind of all the like, juice, secret kind of forms of liquid carbohydrates. So that's going to be kind of a big part of just mastering the basics. And then it's really kind of figuring out what carbohydrate sources work best for you. So as we talked about kind of all that individuality, and then also kind of what is your carbohydrate threshold, meaning what is that right amount of total carbohydrates that seems to work well for you? Because this varies quite a bit. What is generally a universal truth is that the my plate or whatever they call it now, recommendations of like 45 to 65% of your calories from carbohydrates works for very few people. So assume that that's probably not your carbohydrate threshold. I've seen it work very well for young men who are very active, most likely athletes. And that's usually it. So it's kind of figuring out kind of what is that right balance for you. And then, kind of learning also what time of day is best for you to be eating. Obviously, there's limitations within our lives of how much flexibility we have there. But usually we see that if you kind of eat with the time that the sun is out, so daylight hours, you have better results. So the later at night we eat, the higher glucose response we tend to see because insulin and that metabolic system also works on a circadian rhythm. So if you can kind of try to avoid eating really late at night, that can also go a long way.
Gotcha. Okay. And what about, because it seems to me like the trick with carbs and why carbs, I think, get a bad rap is that are most of the things, 70% of what average American eat is processed food, and that's mostly processed carbs, right? But it seems to me the trick is figuring out for each one of us the amount of carb that's appropriate to fuel our activity. So if you're somebody who, let's say you work out, you go to the gym 3 times a week and you walk 10,000 steps every day, and maybe you play a recreational sport a couple times a day, you probably want more carb in your diet because you're using that glucose to fuel all of that activity, as opposed to somebody who, say, does a couple maybe workout classes or yoga classes a week and then is very sedentary for the rest of the time, maybe walks, averages 3,000 steps. Their carb threshold is probably much lower. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And there is a gender difference as well, unfortunately, for my women out there. We tend to see that the carbohydrate threshold for women is a little bit lower than men, especially women going through menopause. So menopause is a very, very real change in your hormones. And with that, we tend to see just kind of a natural increase in insulin resistance to some extent, where then we're not able to process glucose quite as well and carbohydrates quite as well as pre-menopause. Strength training and building up that muscle mass is one of the best ways to kind of keep counteracting that. But we tend to see on average that women who are going through menopause or postmenopausal have a lower carbohydrate threshold than before.
Okay, so that actually is true into postmenopause as well then, huh?
It is, yeah.
Interesting. All right. So ladies out there, and that's most of you listening to this, you're somewhere on that journey. There you go. If you want to get more carbs, more activity, more strength training, more muscle, don't need to be She-Ra, right? Just some lean tone muscle mass will certainly fuel that. And what about, while we're still talking about nutrition, what about carb cycling? And I'm not talking about anything crazy, just like for me personally. So I'll do jujitsu, I play pickleball, I go to the gym, and I'll carb up when I have my pre-gym meal looks different than my meal this morning when I didn't go to the gym. Is that a good fueling strategy? I guess if I had a CGM, I would know this for myself, but it feels as if I want those carbs. My body is asking for those carbs during times of more intense workouts, and less so when my day is going to be walking or maybe doubles pickleball and just kind of casual with friends.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as a framework, it's a great strategy. And as you mentioned, if you're wearing the CGM, you can dial it in to be kind of what is the exact timing and amount that works well. But as a general framework, we do recommend carbohydrate cycling like that. And especially like if people are out of their regular routine, so maybe you're traveling and you're not moving as much, or going on a road trip and you're just sitting all day, or you're on an airplane, really dial it down. You don't need that fast acting energy when you're in those situations. So being able to kind of be flexible and think about, what does my day look like? Those are some of those tools that you can figure out, like very fine-tuned with the CGM, but it's a good strategy overall. And I'm not anti-carb, as you've probably already gathered as well. So I think they certainly have a place. I'm sure every keto advocate would emphasize that you don't need carbs, and that is true, but they are not necessarily bad. They're not going to cause you to have insulin resistance or diabetes. It's just making sure that you're eating the right carbohydrates, and then you're kind of matching it to your threshold that we talked about.
Yeah, so we might not need carbs. They're not essential, but we need them to be happy. You
Yeah.
might not need them to live, but you need them to be happy. I'm with you. I'm a carb lover myself. All right, so I think we get an idea there for food. What about, and this should be pretty quick, exercise? You've already mentioned this a couple of times. Is strength training going to be the best bang for our buck as opposed to, say, lacing up the sneakers and going for a jog, which, I mean, obviously nothing wrong with that. But what's the biggest bang for our buck when it comes to, or maybe is HIIT a better modality? What's the best bang for our buck when it comes to optimal glucose levels?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, always caveat with the more variety you can put in your exercise routine, the better. But if you're only going to do one thing, I am going to pick strength training as kind of the optimal modality for specifically metabolic health and glucose control. Like we talked about, it clears kind of that glycogen storage space, which is really helpful. And then also if you're building up more muscle mass, it's creating more space for your glucose. And actually, insulin resistance often tends to start in our muscles. So that impaired glucose tolerance often starts in the lean muscle mass because we start to store lipid in our muscle, and that kind of alters our body's ability to process insulin and kind of have that good glucose tolerance. So making sure that you're doing strength training, but really any exercise can help that. And then another little tidbit I would put in there is just avoiding sedentary behavior can also go a long way. Kind of as I mentioned about doing walks after meals or getting kind of that movement in. I have like a little timer where every 90 minutes like goes off and reminds me to move because I have a desk job and I tend to work too much.
Yeah.
So kind of that movement can also be really, really critical.
Okay, absolutely love all of that. Now, I want to talk a little bit about stress. I know we've already mentioned this. So I think that it's pretty obvious that for an acute stress, like, all of a sudden there's a car in my lane coming right at me, and there's that acute stress reaction, which includes, I'm guessing, a ginormous glucose dump. That's probably a good thing, right? With that, we evolved
Normal
that as
physiological
it's
response.
normal
Yeah.
physiological response, right? Or if you're, you walking through a dark alley and a bad guy steps in front of you. But what about chronic stress, which is what most of us are experiencing in this day and age? What I can't imagine that's helping our glucose at all. Or is that fair?
No, yeah, it's not. And it's not normal for that chronic stress, yet it is very pervasive, as everyone
Right.
probably can relate to. And I think stress is one of those really tricky things where if we're in a state of chronic stress, it's very hard to identify that. It's hard to know what's maybe not normal when it's your normal. So one thing that can be helpful is just seeing the data and realizing, oh, maybe like stress really is impacting me and maybe that's my thing I need to focus on. But typically what we see in a state of chronic stress is just like a consistently elevated glucose. So instead of that big spike like you mentioned in those acute settings, we're kind of having that low hum of cortisol constantly that's kind of generating glucose basically, because cortisol stimulates glucose production. So what we tend to see is that fasting glucose never really comes down, even though you might be eating well and exercising. Or kind of your average glucose overall is higher. The glucose in the morning and when you're sleeping is just kind of staying at 100 or maybe even 110. So those are usually typically signs of chronic stress, especially if there's no obvious culprit otherwise, like you're not snacking all night long or eating a huge meal right before you go to bed. Then that might be kind of an indicator to look really kind of a little bit more deeply at your stress.
I love the idea, going back again, of this very personalized self-experimentation. If I've got that CGM and if I wanted to maybe start a prayer practice or a gratitude practice or a journaling practice, I could actually look in real time and see how that's impacting my levels over time. So absolutely love that. Here's another big one. I think I know where you're going to go here. What about sleep?
Yep. That's the other big category. So
Yeah,
nutrition,
has to be,
exercise,
right?
stress, and sleep. Yeah.
Gotta be.
So sleep is a huge factor, and I know this can often be one of the more difficult ones for people to address, but poor sleep is essentially a form of chronic stress. So it really does reduce our body's ability to remain sensitive to the effects of insulin and kind of generates that glucose production as well. So this is really two categories. One is just poor quality sleep. So maybe you're in bed for 9 hours, but it's not great quality, and then reduced quantity. So you're only sleeping 6 hours a night as opposed to maybe 8 or 9. Both of those, and this has been pretty well documented in the research, can elevate your glucose levels 25% higher the next day and kind of put your body in that state of insulin resistance. So I've certainly noticed this in my own data of inevitably, you're going to get a bad night of sleep here and there. And when that happens to me, the next morning, my glucose is a little higher and I have higher responses to the same meals that I would normally be eating. So that's just something to monitor for if you're wearing a CGM and kind of like, well, I always eat this meal. What's happening? Taking a look at your sleep the night before can help you kind of understand the different factors that might be going on. But it's a huge factor to be able to kind of maintain that normal circadian rhythm, insulin sensitivity, and then kind of glucose production.
All right, got a few more for you. Those were the big ones, right? Food, exercise, stress, and
Yeah.
sleep. Of course, stress and sleep being two sides really of the same coin there. All right, what about, let's see, I got a couple things I want to ask you. What about fasting, and specifically intermittent fasting? These crazy people I don't mean to make fun of people that are into intermittent fasting, but the people that want you to eat in an 8-hour, 6-hour window. And also, what about prolonged fasting? So maybe somebody who has a religious or spiritual practice who's doing 48 or some longer prolonged fasting. What effect, if any, do they have in general on glucose and blood sugar?
Yeah, so when it comes to fasting, again, it's a big category that can encompass a lot of different approaches, as you mentioned. I think there are some good general rules of thumb. So when it comes to the basics, I recommend to fast for at least 14 hours of the day, which is what most people are doing. And really the thing I see the most when it comes to glucose is to avoid eating at least 3 hours before bed whenever possible. So we kind of touched on that. And to avoid just like grazing all day long, because then you're never letting your body kind of come back down to those normal glucose levels, which can elevate your average glucose overall. So those are kind of the main categories. And then when it comes to more extreme fasting beyond that, I think there can be a time and a place. Sometimes that intermittent fasting is a good strategy that works for someone in order to monitor how much they're eating overall. Sometimes it's easier for people to just be like, well, I only eat in this window, and that's how I'm monitoring how much total volume of food I'm eating and making sure I'm not grazing all day. So if that's a strategy that works for someone, I'm okay with that. Where I see a problem is if this is a form of stress on your body, which can be a healthy stress. But when we stack too many stressors together, sometimes we spill over and we've created that chronic stress. So the problem I would see is the lean female who's doing one meal a day. They're doing sauna and a cold plunge every single day.
Yeah.
They're very, very low carbohydrate. They're going to HIIT class every single day. And their glucose is really high because they are overstressed. They're doing too many hormetic stressors. So I think it's about figuring out the balance of that. But when it comes to the extended fasting, I think it can be a helpful tool if you are actually in a state of insulin resistance and we're trying to heal the body. For the everyday person who's already pretty healthy, from a glucose perspective, I don't think it's necessary. From like the maybe other perspectives of longevity, I think the jury's still out. Maybe not.
I'm with you.
Yeah. I think the downside that people are talking about more now is the potential to lose muscle mass, which is maybe not worth the upsides that we can't quite quantify yet. So I don't tend to recommend extended fasting unless somebody's very interested in trying it. And then the biggest note I will have there is just be super mindful of how you're breaking your fast. I've seen people who do a 3-day fast and then they break it with, a cheeseburger and french fries, and their glucose goes to 300 and it's there for 12 hours. So your body is in a very sensitive state if you haven't eaten for a while. So break it with small food, no carbohydrates, and kind of ease your way in.
I absolutely love it. Yeah, we tell folks here when we get that question about intermittent fasting, especially it's usually in the context of weight loss, my friend at work, whatever. And we say, look, just don't eat after dinner. Don't eat or drink after dinner, and then have a high protein breakfast. You'll be fine.
Yep, I 100% agree. It's that late night, like snacking, but also like the glucose effect that
and it's what we eat after dinner typically, or drink. We're not getting kale and chicken breast at 9 o'clock at night on the sofa. That's not what we're reaching for. It's a glass of wine and popcorn and things like that. So good. All right. A couple of things. Well, speaking of alcohol, I think I know where we're going to go with this, but obviously not a metabolic healthy choice, but does it have an impact on blood sugar, glucose?
Does. And, there's, of course, the higher carbohydrate alcohols that you're going to see the more immediate effects. So like a sugary cocktail or maybe a heavy beer. But some of the like lower carbohydrate drinks, we typically don't see an effect in the moment. And sometimes you actually might see your glucose decrease during alcohol or like when you're drinking alcohol. But we tend to see slightly elevated values the next day. And that's because of oxidative priority is what it's called. When you are consuming alcohol, your body's like, we need to process this above everything else because it's a toxin, technically. So your body is going to prioritize metabolizing that alcohol and kind of put everything else as like a secondary priority. So we tend to see, usually after more than one drink, that impact on the next day glucose values. But there's also that bioindividuality where some people see a pretty dramatic effect by just one drink, where for other people, it's usually like 2 or 3 or 4 when we start to see that more kind of negative impact the next day.
Okay. Interesting. All right, just a couple more for you here. One more really, and extremes of cold and heat, since sauna and cold plunge are all the rage these days. Let's take this example in the context of a healthy person and not somebody who's completely, like you mentioned, not the lady who's doing 1 meal a day and HIIT classes and doing both of these things. So she's got that allostatic load through the roof, but just a normal healthy person. Sauna, cold plunge, any real effects on, is there any studies or on your own personal data? Show anything there?
There are. And then there's kind of what happens in the moment. And then there's like the broader
kind of that
effect.
Long-term, right.
Yeah. So in the moment from sauna specifically, you'll probably see a little bit of a glucose spike. So just something to be like not concerned about. It could be a combination of the actual effect of the heat on the sensor. So just sort of not really a glucose spike. But also there is some research to indicate that, when we're in the sauna, it's sort of like cardiovascular exercise where our heart rate is elevated. And sometimes we see a little bit of a higher glucose response to that, but it's normal. It's fine. In cold plunge, we might see actually our glucose decrease a little bit, but not change too much in the moment. But for both of them, there is research to indicate that it can be helpful. Both of them can be helpful tools for long-term kind of insulin sensitivity and good metabolic health for various reasons. So, sauna, like we mentioned, is kind of it's almost mimicking the effects that we get from exercise. So that's helpful from that perspective. And then cold plunge can activate those brown adipose cells. So it's a type of fat tissue that's actually very metabolically active. So it can kind of stimulate higher metabolic activity and kind of help you basically burn more calories at rest and kind of after that. So both of those seem to have generally positive effects on glucose and metabolic health, but I wouldn't expect, to set expectations. I wouldn't expect people to start a sauna routine and improve their glucose by 50%. It's going to be more of a kind of a mild impact.
Yeah, we like to talk here about boulders and rocks and little rocks and pebbles. And I think when we start getting into things like that, we're down into the little rocks or pebbles, perhaps even. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Fair enough. All right. Last one here. Save the best for last because this is what everybody wants to know. What about supplements? What supplement can I take that's going to magically just give me that beautiful optimal blood sugar? So I don't need to mess with all this other exercise and nerd stuff that we're talking about here.
Yeah, unfortunately, supplements is also probably a pebble or a small rock. So there's no magic supplement you can take and solve all your problems. Berberine tends to be the supplement that we see the best effect overall, though. So you can usually take this once or twice a day, take it with meals, because the only side effect we tend to see is some mild, maybe GI concerns. But this does work pretty well for most people on improving glucose levels. So berberine is a high, and very few like negative side effects from it or kind of downside. So berberine is a good recommendation. Vinegar and like apple cider vinegar, people have probably heard about that, actually does work fairly well. So you can kind of take the apple cider vinegar supplements or gummies, but you can also have kind of like an apple cider vinegar drink before your meals, and that can actually improve glucose quite a bit at meal times. So those are two big ones. And then there are some supplements that help if you have a deficiency. So they're not really going to help beyond that if you don't have a deficiency, but vitamin D, of course, being one of the big ones. Yeah. Right. Zinc, magnesium, chromium, some of the B vitamins, also fiber. So getting adequate fiber, but if you're struggling to reach that through your food, potentially considering like, a psyllium husk or some sort of fiber supplement. All of those things are, part of that metabolic system. So if we're low in any of those, it might make that process more inefficient.
Gotcha. So the berberine then, just to be clear, is that something that I would take kind of similar to the apple cider vinegar where I'm going to just have a little drink before I eat and that's going to help balance that out? Or is that something I would just take long term and it would have an effect that way?
Yeah, good clarification. More long term. So we tend to see the effects start to happen after like the first couple weeks of taking it.
So okay, so it's not something that's going to immediately, that makes sense. All right.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Where the apple cider vinegar, you see the impact kind of right then.
Got it. Okay. Well, Kara, as we're wrapping up, I want to get your opinion here because obviously you're out here on the front lines of this. What is your level of optimism or pessimism on where we're headed as a culture when it comes to our health? Obviously, we're going the wrong direction right now. Just here in the U.S., we're not moving in the right direction. Are you optimistic that we are going to turn this thing around? Is what we're fighting against too big? Is technology going to save us? I'd just love to get your general sense of where you think we are, where you think we're headed, and just kind of your personal take on whether you see some goodness in the future or is it going to get darker?
I'm very optimistic. Maybe I'm always that way, but I do feel very hopeful and very optimistic overall. Even just thinking about, 6 years ago when I was trying to talk about CGMs and everyone's like, that's weird and stupid. Why would anybody wear a CGM if they don't need to? And tons of people are wearing them now. More people, I'm seeing a shift, and maybe it's definitely still a minority, but it's still growing in individuals caring more and asking questions and trying things and looking into this. So that makes me really optimistic. I think change comes from kind of those accumulating small movements. And I think people are starting to ask the right questions and really kind of think about their health. And I think the topics are more broadly being spoken about. There's more podcasts now, there's more information out. And I think accessibility to good, better, maybe health information and resources and tooling is going to improve with AI. I think kind of it will hopefully even the playing field a little bit, where before maybe you had to pay for an extremely expensive consult to get kind of high quality concierge advice, where now you might just be able to get the same advice from ChatGPT. Again, we want to sift through and still critically think and be our own advocates, but I'm optimistic that the accessibility to this information is going to improve and kind of even out the playing field as well.
Absolutely love it. Yeah, I'm with you. I'm also optimistic, although at times it can just seem almost insurmountable that when you look at just the way the financial reality of big pharma, big food, and our systems are set up, it just seems like that's a pretty big ship to turn around very quickly. But I love where technology is going. I don't think technology is necessarily going to save us. I very strongly believe that we as individuals are responsible for our health. But to your point, we have more information than ever. We have all these wearables and we have all this data. Now, what do we do with it? And I think that's where AI might have a big impact from a health perspective for us in the future. To your point, if I can take all my CGM data and all my doctor blood work data and all my, heck, now we can, for $500, you can get your genome sequence. I can take all that information. I just pour it into something that helps me then give me actionable advice. Okay, Kevin, here's your personalized recommendation for health and optimizing your health, etc. So we'll see.
I agree. Yeah. You no longer have to be an analyst or a PhD or, a specialist yourself to be able to at least kind of get some takeaways from all that information. So
right.
I think it's going to be good. But
all right, there you go. Think it's going to be good. All right. Well, Kara, let's wrap this up. Where can people connect with you? Where can they learn about Nutrisense? Most importantly, where can they get a CGM and get started on this journey?
Yeah, so to learn more or kind of actually just jump in, you'd go to our website, so nutrisense.io. We have a blog and a newsletter there for lots of information to learn more, but you can also sign up for our plans there. We have where you could just do 1 month of sensors or longer subscriptions. We also have where you can just sign up to have a consult with one of our dietitians. We take insurance, so it's usually free for most people, and kind of start there if you aren't sure if you want to jump in yet. They're all glucose experts, so they can kind of talk about this information more. And then Nutrisense is also on all the social media platforms. So we always post lots of insights our customers are having and stories and examples of their graphs. And you can also follow me on Instagram as well. So Kara Collier RD. And I'm also always talking about glucose.
Right on. Okay, folks, I will put all of that information in the show notes. You guys can find that on whatever app you're listening to this on, or certainly over at the website. But Kara, I want to thank you so much for coming on, taking the time to share your wisdom and your knowledge with us, but most of all for the work you're doing. I think it is amazing that you took that brave step to take this on and you're out there leading the charge. Absolutely love it. Just encourage you to keep up the great work.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It was great chatting.
Okay, that's our show for today, folks. If you are interested in learning how the Silver Edge Collective program can help you feel lean, strong, and confident again, you can find a link to learn more in the show notes for this episode. You guys can find that on whatever app you are listening to this on, or head over to silveredgefitness.com/374. As we wrap up our time together today, you can show your support for this show in 2 important ways. The first is to tell a friend about this podcast and encourage them to give it a listen. The second is for you YouTube folks to please click the like and subscribe buttons, and for you podcast folks to please give this podcast a 5-star review on whatever platform you listen to podcasts on, and be sure to subscribe and follow so you don't miss any future episodes. I really appreciate you spending your time with me today, and until next time, stay strong.